All right, well, let's get started. We may have some additional folks come in. Welcome, everybody, to the Pedagogy Work Group. I'll introduce myself really quickly, and then I'll let my co-convener introduce himself. I am Rich Bowles. I serve as Associate Professor of Preaching and Worship at Union Presbyterian Seminary in Richmond, Virginia. This is my, I think, second year of leading this work group. And brand new to convening with me is Trey Clark. Trey, love for you to introduce yourself to everybody.
Well, hello, I'm Trey Clark, and I am Assistant Professor of Preaching and Spiritual Formation at Fuller Seminary. I also serve as our Dean of Chapel, and I'm excited about our work group.
Yeah, thanks, Trey. We had a really fantastic response to our work group in the paper requests. So if you see papers that have something to do with pedagogy in other work groups, that's because we had so many papers that we had to farm them out to other work groups. So I'm really pleased with the response that we had and the interest in pedagogical issues. As Trey and I talked about our work for this year, one of the things that we thought about was how is it that we could think about this theme of building bridges and what happens beyond the seminary classroom space? And as the co-edited book from John and Ali was before us, we thought this would be a fantastic connection to thinking about pedagogy beyond the boundaries of the seminary or college classroom. So really excited to have them today. I'll introduce all of our folks really quickly. Obviously, you're here for the book panel on Learning Together to Preach, which is available from Cascade and was published in 2023. But John McClure is the Charles G. Finney Professor Emeritus of Preaching and Worship at Vanderbilt Divinity School. And Ali Utley is the Assistant Professor of Liturgy and Practical Theology at Phillips Theological Seminary in Tulsa, Oklahoma. They're going to spend some time talking about the book with us this morning or this afternoon now. And we've got two panelists who are going to respond to the book. So Lisa Cressman, who is the founding steward of Backstory Preaching. Lisa, give a wave for anybody who might not know you. All right, thank you. And then Larry Morris, who is a PhD student at Christian Theological Seminary in the African American Preaching and Sacred Rhetoric program. But Larry also holds the certificate in homiletic peer coaching from the program that is at Vanderbilt or was at Vanderbilt Divinity School. So Larry, if you would wave, just kind of show people who you are for now. All right. I won't take up much more space at this point, but John and Ali are going to present for somewhere around 20 minutes or so, and then we'll pivot to hearing responses from Lisa and Larry, and then we'll have some conversation among the group. So feel free to respond in the chat, think about questions or comments that you might offer when our time has concluded. So with that being said, John and Ali, we turn it over to you, and we really look forward to hearing from you all sharing about the book.
Great, thanks. I was going to start off with about maybe 10 minutes of sort of background for how this book came into existence, and then Allie's going to and also to kind of jump into some of the larger elements of the book, and then Allie's going to bore down a little bit on some of the best practices and so on that for coaching. So this project that this book grew out of, it actually began back, and in the preface of the book, I talk about this. It began back at Louisville Presbyterian Seminary when Dale Andrews and I, the late great Dale Andrews and I, started preaching together. That was our first gig together, and so we got a small grant there and established a program in what we called homiletic supervision, and it was a certificate program. And our goal was to try to figure out a way at that point to use clinical pastoral education models, which were quite popular. This would have been in the mid to late 90s, and to just think about what it would take to supervise preachers using those kinds of methodologies. And Dale was particularly excellent in those practices. Having worked as a social worker and other things, Dale had special knowledge. We did that for 5 years together. Then I went to Vanderbilt, and then when Dale came to Vanderbilt, we had the opportunity in 2013 when the Lilly Endowment established their initiative to strengthen the quality of preaching program to really reboot that program in a new way. When we finished that 5-year project at Louisville, we figured out that supervising preacher supervision works really well when you're coaching people for whom there are clear standards of clear professional standards that are universal, right? So nursing, let's say, which is where supervision really works well. But with preachers, there was just a lot of gray areas that had to do with their own formation, the kinds of things that were just a little more slippery. The whole business of sort of helping preachers fashion their powers in and around specific situations and so on. So we kind of began to think it through in terms of, why don't we think more about coaching then as a model? And Lilly was really interested in peer coaching models. So how would we do this if we establish groups of peers who would learn how to coach one another? So we established that our program was to train people to actually lead these kinds of peer coaching groups and to be sort of what we call lead coaches. But the sort of the model is kind of peer-based, and therefore what grew out of this was a model that we called collaborative peer coaching. That's a lot to say. Relates, obviously, I'm somebody who is big on collaborative preaching, so it, models of collaboration and how to do the kind of listening that's key to collaborative preaching translates well over here. Dale had brought this wonderful wisdom from the African American preaching tradition, the apprenticeship model that had written about, in which apprentices would listen carefully and learn the apprentice, to use his language, and then help them in their own unique way to experience a kind of encounter with material and then re-encounter their own preaching and mentor them forward. So we really built those kinds of ways of thinking together into a collaborative model of preaching, which is non-directive in nature, a collaborative model of coaching preaching, which is not highly directive. As you know, coaching models can swing all the way from, I don't know, your favorite college coach, insisting on particular ways, to highly non-directive, guidance kind of models. So ours is somewhere leaning toward the guidance model, but it has we actually talk about it as being learner-centered to some extent, highly learner-centered, but also, using Parker Palmer's language, subject-centered, because we want to, in the context of a learner-centered model, work hard to find that, what Palmer calls the great subject. In any sort of peer coaching session, what we're about is trying to let the curriculum emerge. And so what the subject is that we're going to be learning emerges in that kind of non-directive listening, deep listening in encounter. So that was the kind of model that we began to work toward and hone. So over a 10-year period, we honed 3 different models of this. One model is what we call a preacher formation approach. I'm going to leave it to Allie to say maybe a little more about these models, but that's focused more on case studies that preachers themselves bring. Hey, here's what I'm going through, or hey, here's a story from my childhood that I think affects, the way that I preach. It could bring bringing life story. So it's really story-based coaching, life story-based coaching. So preacher formation, then sermon formation coaching. How do we do that? How do we do coaching when we have a sermon in the middle of the process, and try to get, really give voice to the kinds of things that need to be said in a dialogical way when there's a sermon in the room. So sermon formation, and then the final model is what we call individual coaching, which is really a model that it's more one-on-one. These other models can be done in group, and they're really meant to be done best in a peer group, where you've got a group of folks who then are working together with a preacher. But then in the individual model, we hunker down on what are the things that we might, that we are learning. Let's lift those things out, and then in an individual format, let's talk about accountability going forward. So what's where do we go with all of this? Are there learnings here that in fact could make a difference? And if so, where do we go from here? So there's a little more of a focus in that in the individual coaching model on accountability. Our process involved what we called and what really from the supervision world is sometimes called parallel learning, and that's a rather complex term that indicates that in our process of doing this particular program, we had different levels of learning going on. So, for instance, at the first level, we had preachers who are being coached as they presented either sermons or their own life narratives. So at one level of our process in our training program, everyone experienced themselves as a kind of peer member of the group, just simply presenting something, right? So everybody gets to know what it feels like to be coached from the inside out. Right, you experience it as somebody who is being coached. But then at the second level, peer group members are being coached as peer coaches, right? And so here's the group, and they need to get feedback on how they're doing, right, as peer coaches in terms of how well are we doing in terms of asking questions. Or listen, learning how to ask questions is really listening, asking questions, wondering, being curious. So how are we doing as a peer group coaching one of our peers? So that's level number 2 of parallel learning that's going on in this process. And then at level 3, then preachers members of the of this peer group are being supervised as what we call lead coaches. In other words, there's somebody who's in charge of the group and in charge of this whole coaching process. And they have to be learning also and receiving feedback on their leadership of the group and of the individual coaching sessions. They're the ones who are running the peer coaching session. So they need feedback. Now, when we gathered at Vanderbilt, there were 2 ways in which this final piece happened, because our program was designed to train these lead coaches. Right? So all the peer members took their turn as lead coaches and needed to get feedback on what they were doing. So we used, before the pandemic, we used a fishbowl a model to accomplish that, where our leadership team would be on the outside, and then the group would do their work together. And then at the end, we would engage in conversations. Every now and then, we would actually interrupt the group to either make an observation or encourage a reboot around something. But typically our team of teachers of this method would remain quiet, taking notes, and at the end then engage in different kinds of conversations about how the peer group did, what they did well or not, what the lead coaches did in their leading of the group or didn't do or might have done, and so on. And that's more of a supervision piece within our program, because we are trying to hold them to certain standards of leading these groups. We don't want to train coaches who do not. So we did, have certain standards that we were looking for that. And then in the second place, then all of these members of these groups would go out and coach groups, right, for a year. And they would video those and send us tapes. And so we had 2 folks who supervised them in their work. So they had a certain number of experiences that they had to receive feedback on. Now that changed. The pandemic took some of this out of us, or at least modified that a good bit. But there was a field work piece that also for them, so that as lead coaches, they would get at least a couple of good supervisory sessions out in the field. So that sort of gives you a feel of our program for training coaches. Our goal with this book was then to write up our process, all the dimensions of it. The first half of the book is really to kind of help us help the reader sort out these, what are the main dimensions, if you will, of this. We had our leadership team would do didactics on things like communication, on the moral dimension, the analytic dimension, the embodiment dimension of preaching. So we had a lot of things that our peer group members were learning, and our coaches were learning how to keep an eye out for and to work with and from. So, and you've got some of those wonderful people here. We've got some of them here today who actually worked with us around those particular topics. And then in the second part of the book, we invited those who had finished the program and were doing really cool things with interesting things with their coach in their coaching ministry to write chapters. So Allie wrote a chapter on seminary, using it just in MDiv education. How does this approach inform what one might do? And we assumed that people are going to, we hope, take the core ideas that we give, but they're going to have to shape them for different contexts in different ways. So what does it look like in seminary education? What does this look like in a denominational peer learning program? Like just a denominational judicatory says, we want to have a coaching program. And so Carolyn, she did a chapter on a group in Nashville of Episcopalian preachers who did this on a kind of year-long extended basis. What does this look like in a retreat setting? So Monica wrote a chapter on retreats and doing this, and just if I've got 5 days to do a coaching group, what's it? What does this have to look like? Seminary-based continuing education, that's another approach, or just non-traditional training. Kelly Hudlow, who's with us today in this session. What about commissioned lay preachers in a denomination that need to be, who may not have had seminary training? How does this model work in that? So anyway, that was that's the sort of background, and I'll turn it over to Allie to maybe talk a little more then about the actual key practices that are, really most central to what is involved with doing collaborative homiletic peer coaching. So Allie, I'll kind of flip it to you.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I really am teaching in an MDiv setting primarily, but see myself doing collaborative peer coaching. So in the classroom, I can of course offer some didactics, some methods for biblical interpretation, or building blocks to create a sermon. But ultimately, my students, whether they've been preaching for 5 minutes or for years, they are the experts on how to preach in their context and in their own voice. So that's why I find this model of coaching so helpful, even in the seminary classroom. So as John said, we have these 3 different models that we present in the book, and all 3 of them, I think, are just about shared knowledge and shared experience and shared encounters with each other and with the divine. The 3 models he mentioned are the sermon formation, and at the center of that is a personal narrative from the pastor, something about their lives, some event or encounter that has shaped who they are as preacher. And then the sermon formation model, in the center of that is, of course, the sermon, and that is processed in a group setting. And then the third is the individual coaching model. So let me look at my notes so I already went away from my notes, I already got lost. But I think, so the first that I mentioned, the preacher formation, is about, I think, exploring pastoral identity with people and exploring that pastoral identity as it relates to their preaching. So as John said, the preacher offers a brief narrative, and then the group asks questions to help the preacher reflect on the significance of that narrative for their preaching life. The group peer coaching model, the sermon formation, this and the first one share the same basic structure. So it starts with a couple of minutes of an opening ritual, something to just set aside this time as, I would say, as a sacred time together to gather around the subject. And then a few minutes to do what we would call setting the stage. So if it's describing your context or giving the group any kind of information that they might need to know to facilitate this reflection process. And then there's a set amount of time to share either this personal narrative in the preacher formation or to view a sermon together or listen to a sermon in the sermon formation method. After that, the core of the model, I think, is this opportunity to respond to what you've heard. And a significant difference between the preacher formation and the sermon formation is in this, this time for feedback. So in the sermon formation, your peers are asking you direct questions that you have an opportunity to respond to immediately. In the sermon formation model, it works differently because the preacher is not immediately responding to the feedback. So in the classroom setting, and you can imitate this on Zoom as well, but in the classroom, I have the people offering feedback gather in a circle, and the preacher is not in the circle at all. They're overhearing the feedback. So their classmates or their peers are discussing their own encounters with the sermon. What is their internal dialogue as they listen? What emotions come up for them, or what questions come up? And they center their feedback around the preacher's desired feedback. What do they want to learn? What do they want to get out of this? But there's a barrier, an invisible barrier that permits the preacher to overhear the conversation, to overhear the peer reactions and correlations and connections without having to immediately respond. And then they can take what they want or leave whatever they want from the discussion. And I think that as much learning happens about preaching in the giving feedback as in receiving feedback. It really encourages peers or students to think about how they encounter a sermon. And I think as a guide, I can push them to think about why, right? So the instinct is often to say, well, I really liked this part. Well, tell me more, right? Why did you like it? That's not very helpful information for the preacher. So as you kind of dig into this stuff, I think we learn a lot about preaching together. The third model follows a similar format, and ideally this individual coaching either follows or is accompanied by preacher formation and sermon formation. But this third model is the individual coaching. And as John pointed out, it just allows for a bit of a deeper engagement and a closer analysis of a sermon. So a couple of key components of this process in the individual coaching are identifying what the preacher wants to work on, identifying what they want to discuss, and setting goals for their future preaching. All of these models are indirect, inductive, and collaborative. When I was a student at Vanderbilt and first got roped into this program, and when I was a student of Dale Andrews, I'll say that I was so resistant to this kind of inductive methodology. Like, so as resistant as you could probably be in a PhD program. And I remember I was TAing for one of Dale's classes, and it was on rhetoric and preaching. And
You were the worst. You were the worst.
I was. And I remember going to his office because we had some students that were really pushing back on some of the material in the class. And I was like, Dale, why don't you just tell them that they're wrong? Like, why can't, like, what they're saying is just like not true. Like, why can't you just say that? And he said, well, I mean, who would that serve, right? If I were to do that, who would that serve? That serves me, not my students. So I've really come around to these ideas. I think they will be so amused by how like steadfast and true I am to this inductive method in my own teaching. My first semester at Phillips, in teaching was really difficult for me because the students here were really not accustomed to this approach to teaching. They were much more accustomed to a banking model, right? Where they're just given information and then they're tested on it. They have online classes that are discussion boards where you read on Monday, you post on Wednesday, you respond on Thursday, very formulaic, very clear expectations. And I came in with a very different approach to teaching, and probably because of karma, felt a lot of resistance to this. One of my colleagues said, oh, don't worry about it. By the end of the first year, they're going to know what to expect from your classes, and they're going to talk to each other on social media and Facebook. And sure enough, just this last weekend, I was teaching a class, and somebody made a comment, oh, Dr. Utley doesn't give instructions like that. She wants you to figure it out on your own. I was like, yeah. So they're starting to get the picture. But I say that for all three of these models, the fundamental element for me, and the thing that has shaped the way that I teach and really the way that I listen to sermons, the way that I engage with people pastorally, the fundamental element is learning to ask good questions, and being fully present and just really curious about each other, in this setting, or in whatever setting you're in. So I'm going to list just some of the qualities of a good question, and these come from the book. Good questions are clear, concise, and direct. They avoid digression, meandering, or circumlocution. So if you ever go to AER, like, this is not the kind of question that we're looking for. Or if you ever sat through a presidential debate, right? This is not what we're going for. Good questions are open-ended. An answer or category of possible answers is not anticipated within the way questions are asked. So we're not trying to ask leading questions. I'm not trying to give you feedback. I'm not trying to give you direct feedback in the form of a question, right? I'm not doing like these weird semantics. I want to ask a genuine question. Good questions are responsive. They build on what has already been said and respond to what has already been said. And this is just about being present with each other and listening to each other. Good questions are adventurous and explorative. They treat the subject at hand as filled with possibility rather than as easily nailed down. And then the last one is good questions are sincere. They're asked in good faith. They are asked by someone who's being truthful in what they're asking, someone who is genuinely open to an answer that may not be expected or desired. And I'll say this last one has dramatically changed the way I grade and give feedback on sermons. So I think of, in the classroom, we do the preacher formation model, this collaborative experience. And then in my written feedback, I think of it much more as individual coaching, whether we meet in person or I give that feedback in an email. It has really been a good practice for me to figure out what kind of feedback I can give that feels sincere to me, that I'm not just reaching for formulaic, nice job, thanks for your work on this, that I'm really, and it can be hard, especially when I think a sermon is unclear, or not well organized, but I think it's made a huge difference in my teaching. And I've really come to believe that the most important part of my job as a teacher of preaching or as a peer coach is to help cultivate a curiosity in the people that I work with, and help to cultivate the ability to ask these kinds of good questions. So I know I'm right at 10 minutes, but I'm going to go for 2 more if that's okay. I'm gonna end here with what we really do at the beginning of all of these models, which is covenant setting. And I imagine that everyone in the room has probably had some experience of getting together with a group and starting with setting a covenant. And it's not always effective, because if you don't hold yourself to the covenant, it's a waste of time, to be frank. But what I think is helpful about setting a covenant is that it gives you a method for holding people accountable. And I think it's more gentle. But the beginning of our covenant for these coaching models come from Parker Palmer. And these are the things that I don't know if John would say non-negotiable, but I think I would say that these are the things that are non-negotiable in this process. The first is that there's no advising. When preachers ask questions, when they present something to you, we're not going to give them advice. When advice is offered, there's a shift away from asking questions. And I think it prevents folks from being able to discover their own way forward. The second one on their covenant is that there's no fixing, which is very closely related to advising. It's because when you're trying to fix someone's preaching, or even worse, trying to, fix something in someone's narrative, you're implying that it's broken, right? That they're doing something incorrectly. And that I think that can be a really harmful experience for folks who are learning to preach, or folks who are vulnerable enough to engage in this process of getting feedback on their sermons from their peers. It just disempowers the preacher from finding new ways of thinking and acting that will work best for them in their context. The third one is no saving. And I think that I see this most often in the classroom. And my interpretation is that it stems from discomfort with conflict, or with truth telling. And especially preachers, I think they want to affirm each other, right? And so they don't want they want to save. And so saving a preacher makes sermon feedback more about us rather than the person preaching. So for instance, and this is from the book, a preacher may say, "I'm worried about how I crafted this introduction." And the coach or someone in the peer coaching group says, "Well, I thought your introduction was just fine," or "I really liked the introduction." In this case, the coaching process turns on its heels and becomes about our experience of the sermon rather than the preacher's experience and set of concerns. So it kind of shuts down the coaching process entirely by removing the preacher's concerns and replacing it with the group's affirmations. So I think I'm going to end with just a quote from the book. "It's important to remember that these three models can and should be adjusted to meet the situation in which they are used. In their current form, they are shaped in a way as to aid in the education of collaborative coaches. In other words, they are shaped so that coaches are encouraged to develop skills in attending curiosity, questioning, group process, and in forms of intervention and accountability. When all is said and done, it is our hope that coaches will learn to work in a collaborative way, always with a close eye toward the lived experience of the preacher, the eventfulness of preaching, and the desire for preachers to set learning goals that will help them to integrate the homiletical knowledge that they already have." So thanks for the opportunity to talk a little bit more about these models, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Allie. That's a really helpful orientation for folks who may not have had a chance to read the book yet. And so Lisa and Larry, we will turn to you both in that order for your responses and thoughts and questions that you may have around the book. So we look forward to hearing from both of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rich and Trey, for the invitation. And this book was really fun for me to read. I valued it a lot because I just plain agree with it. And it was very, very nice that you all went to all this trouble to pretty much affirm what we do at Backstory Preaching. And so thank you for going to all that work to tell us that we're doing the right thing. So Backstory Preaching is an online ministry, and what happens in this book is what we do as well. So we have a year-long mentorship program so people experience what it's like to receive feedback, and also to talk about their formation, what we call their backstory. And then if some people are invited to be trained in a second year, where we call being an apprentice. So then they're learning to be, in your language, lead coaches. So I sincerely hope that all preachers, all preaching educators are going to read, mark, learn, inwardly digest, and apply Learning Together to Preach, because I am such a big advocate of this model. So simply put, the formation of the preacher is equally as important as learning how to form a sermon. And then when the two of them are integrated together, then we become authentic embodiments of and perpetual witnesses of the gospel. Coincidentally, this morning, I was reading Raising Kids Beyond the Binary, Celebrating God's Transgender Diverse Children by Jamie Brusihoff. And I apologize if I am butchering her last name. So although the author is addressing parents, I felt that there were a few sentences that beautifully described the purpose of learning together to preach in developing wise, curious, compassionate preaching educators, coaches, and collaborative peer groups. And I'll substitute some words of hers to fit our context. So she's saying that in general, again, in our language, preaching educators assume that we know so much more than our students. And that teaches them to doubt themselves. If there was one thing I could offer to preachers, it would not necessarily be a piece of advice, but maybe an affirmation. You know yourself. You know your congregation. Together, you will get to know each other even more. Get quiet. Listen. Trust yourself and trust them. So while all of learning together to preach is worthy of deep conversation, I'm going to organize my remarks around the 4 invitations that are issued by the authors. So the first invitation is to allow pedagogical assumptions to be challenged. The book, I felt, did that very successfully by shifting the usual kind of academic model of learning to preach, or to preach more effectively, from being only about best practices to including the inductive formation of the preacher. And as I said, that's congruent with the model we use at Backstory Preaching, because it's the preacher's backstory, who they are as human beings, as they develop an authentic congruence of the gospel in and out of the pulpit. Learning together to preach is synonymous with one of Backstory Preaching's taglines: preaching is your life is preaching. So BSP and Learning Together to Preach show that best practices can be learned and applied while the preacher is also being formed spiritually. Those two are not mutually exclusive, and even in a very short amount of time with preaching students, those two things go hand in hand and they keep enhancing each other, and you really can't do one effectively without the other. However, learning together also challenged some of my own pedagogical assumptions, which I'm not too happy about, because I wanted to know I was doing everything perfectly, but you got me too. And so I'm going to be implementing particularly more reflective questions about the sermon formation model, and in our group and individual mentoring as a result. And I am genuinely grateful for opening my eyes to additional ways that we can be doing this better. The second invitation in Learning to Preach is to get the feel of the game so that the practice seems more accessible and learnable. Through the 2 parts of the book, part 1 about the dimensions of homiletical peer coaching, and then part 2 illustrating 5 experiences in applying the model, I saw how the practice works, and I was easily able to imagine it in multiple contexts, and in particular in established programs. The intended readers are those interested in pedagogy. How is preaching best learned? And I felt that was clear and accessible throughout the book. The other audience is those asking whether this would work for me. It wasn't entirely clear to me whether that meant potential participants, educators, or working preachers who might want to organize their own collaborative peer group. It was easier for me to envision how preaching educators could apply its wisdom than perhaps a working preacher would get something like this up and running, because there is a lot to learn and consider about this approach in order to do it well. And so perhaps when we get to our discussion time, you might address that question. The third invitation is to create a shared pedagogical vocabulary. We at Backstory Preaching are also working towards the development of a common dictionary so that homiletic peer coaching and mentoring can be done well, and we're talking apples to apples. On page 14, when this invitation is offered, there are 17 terms listed, just to name a few. So again, if working preachers, if they're part of the audience and trying to form their own groups as part of the aim of this book, then I would struggle to imagine how they would not feel overwhelmed by learning how to apply the concepts, in addition to also just figuring out program logistics, because that is not a simple thing to do either. The fourth invitation is to expand the conversation beyond the authors, and that readers will experiment, explore, adapt, revise, situate, and further develop what is set forth here. The wisdom imparted here can be easily adapted and developed across many contexts and can be transformational for many preachers. So I know firsthand how transformational inductive preaching and sermon formation is, and I sincerely hope many are going to take up this invitation and apply this work, and I have no trouble imagining myriad ways that it can be adapted. I'm not quite persuaded that can be done easily, and especially, again, if working preachers are part of the audience intended. For example, I was not surprised by the example of the facilitator who struggled to find enough preachers to participate in a denominational peer group, in spite of having an entire Episcopal diocese to recruit from. She still had trouble finding even a few people. We find that drafting invitations to participate in preaching groups, that is an art form unto itself. And so support for learning how to invite, along with a lot of the other how-tos, would probably be gratefully received by those who might want to apply this program. And then finally, Ann Dybert says in her chapter on supervision that supervision never ends, with which I wholeheartedly agree. So at Backstory Preaching, for example, our mentors, there are about 25 mentors now. So they and I engage in monthly peer supervision. And in short, I am such a believer in transformation and peer supervision that I would love to see learning to preach be offered among us. And I mean among the members of the Academy. What would it look like if small groups of us came together to create sacred space and covenant to ask questions in service of our continued formation? What would happen if we left our degrees and our teaching experience outside the sacred circle to share sermons or share teaching practices and to ask sermon formation questions like Ali described and use those to consider and not in order to save or fix or suggest? What would happen if we built bridges to each other using learning to preach to get quiet and listen, to continually deepen trust in ourselves, in each other, in our students, and in the Word? So what would happen if we got quiet and listened to each other? Thank you.
Lisa, thank you. Thank you so much. We'll have a chance for John and Ali to be able to respond to your queries. But Larry, would you respond as well?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to Rich and Trey for inviting me to be a part of this panel, and for John and Ali, it's good to see you again as well. And also to Lisa, I've heard so much good stuff about Backstory Preaching. I have some colleagues that participated in your work, so it's good to meet you and see you on screen. So I also hold this work as a participant, but also as a spiritual director. And so I also spend time with clergy, with pastors, in a spiritual director setting, spiritual direction setting. So even though sometimes it's not directly about preaching, things of preaching come up. And so one of the things that really has grasped me with this book and this project, um, is this equal attention to the preacher formation and the sermon formation, which Lisa has already lifted up. That both are important, and my experience has been that as people change and grow, their preaching changes and grows. And the book names many times that there's often not a lot of spaces for preachers and pastors to be together and to grow together, right? To be held, to have questions asked, to simply be in community with each other. And so this book provides an opportunity to do that. I think even in the beginning of the book, in the preface, Dr. McClure talks about, he names two caveats around the writers, around just the writers not being as diverse as they would like for them to be, due to the passing of Dale and then the withdrawal of a particular writer, right? And so I think even naming that is helpful in the beginning, because it allows, I think, this expectation for folks to know that the writers may not be as diverse, but there is some leeway or some the ability to shape and to mold kind of how this work is implemented in communities and cultures. So I actually found this to be very, very helpful. As a part of the last cohort, our cohort was very diverse, and so my experience was a bit different, bit different. Uh, But I think even naming the dimensions of the peer coaching process uh, was helpful, particularly Dr. Lisa Thompson's chapter on embodied dimension of homiletical pre-coaching, which again allows folks who have different embodiments, different experiences, to bring their experience to the coaching cohort, right? And so I think again it allows folks to be their authentic selves and to also wrestle with what does it mean to preach in whatever form of embodiment they have. Um, I also think it was helpful to this inductive way of teaching. It does it doesn't discount people's lived experiences, and so I've facilitated a couple of groups of people who have who've been to seminary, then folks who are lay leaders, right? And to me it kind of allows for this hierarchy not to be in the space, that your lived experience is as important as what someone has learned in seminary. But I also found to be really helpful in this book is, in addition to the information, there are really clear um, a clear format, right? That you don't have to necessarily think of something. Right? You can use this format and tweak it as you need to do so, which I think allows an entryway for folks to try out any one of the models, whether that's the preacher formation model, the seminar formation model, or the individual coaching model. I do also agree that the individual collaborative coaching uh, is, I've seen it most beneficial when there has been some preacher formation group or some summer formation group. Uh, because I think it again allows for the person to focus on their formation as a preacher, as well as the formation of the sermon. My experience has also been that it is this parallel learning does happen. It is really a different way of talking about preaching when you ask preachers to ask open-ended questions or to do deep listening and to resist this notion of trying to fix, right? So I've implemented this model in my own kind of homiletical peer coaching, but I've also been in other spaces with our denomination who are getting preachers together. They have these conversations, and I always do this initial kind of conversation around um, this covenant piece, right? And so I always create some time to do that as a way to remind folks that we are asking open-ended questions. We're not necessarily trying to fix each other, and to create this space where when it does happen, as a facilitator, I can say, we decide this is not the space for that. And it's uncomfortable, but I think it does help people listen, right? It helps preachers to listen to each other and to listen to what the preacher is trying to say. There's also some really, really practical things that I mentioned before in the book, and that's the layout for the different kind of sessions that you can have. I think the four coach chart is also helpful in individual coaching. I've used that a couple of times for people to kind of see how their sermons are mapped out, and that visual is helpful for preachers as well. I know there's caution around when you should use that, and mostly in individual coaching and not in the group coaching places. What else can I say about the book? So again, I think I think there are these practical pieces to it around around, the space that you can create, um, and the ways in which it can be used. And so I've used it, like I said, in my own practice, really using kind of the same format that we were taught, but also in spaces where I'm just coming in as a facilitator for preachers for a few sessions, uh, and really helping people to listen to each other and to share their stories. And so I'm thinking about one particular time. Um, and I think in Don's chapter, she talks about what are preachers' spiritual values, right? And so preachers don't often have a space to kind of think about that. It may change over time, but creating the space and allowing folks to be held and not judged, but held in that space as they think about that, it's really been helpful and important, particularly for some of the sessions that I led, and for folks to kind of wrestle with their own sense of growth and theologies and how that changes, right? That we are not static folks, that our lived experience changes, and shapes the way in which we preach and the way in which we view the divine. Uh, I do have the other question that I have is I'll be implementing most of this online, some in person. And so I know there's a limitation about the writings not really addressing some of the online components. So I'm curious about that. And I'm also curious about um, the way to build bridges, right? So sometimes when we talk about diversity, particularly in this book, it seems like it was just limited to like race and culture. But I'm thinking about the different ways of embodiment. I'm thinking about like gender and sexuality as well, and how that may impact the this particular model or these models of coaching and learning, um, and just curiosities around that piece. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Larry. We've got about, what's that, to 18 minutes. So John and Ali, if there's anything that you all would like to respond to, and then when y'all feel like you've had a good shot, then we'll open it up, see who has questions and comments for you.
I can start with just a couple of quick responses. I think that the question that you asked about building bridges is important. And I mean, the building bridges metaphor, for me, I have like a lot of questions about what that even means, right? Building bridge from what to what? What's the gap? What's the gap that we're trying to bridge here? But what I heard you asking about is how do we think about these multiple identities and intersectionalities in our preaching? And I think that what's really exceptional about these models of feedback is that you're not hearing someone say to you, well, this sermon was really sexist or this sermon was racist, but you're hearing a person who identifies as a woman saying, this is how I heard this, right? It's when you're talking about your own encounter with the sermon, I think that's heard differently than hearing the accusations or being cut down or, because I don't think anyone, that's not true. In my circles, people are not intentionally trying to harm other people through their sermons, right? In the places I'm teaching and preaching. But I think that one of the cool things about these formation models is that you are hearing how people in diverse bodies and with diverse experiences are encountering your sermon. The other thing I wanted to respond to is this piece about recruiting and retaining and getting the preacher folks to engage processes like this. It's really hard. I'm sure I'm not the only person on this call who has a Lilly grant. And, I thought I have the best program. I'm just going to give all these churches so much money and ideas, and everyone's going to be knocking down the door to participate. Well, that's not true because people are really busy. And no matter how much you have to offer by way of resources and finances, it's really hard to recruit and retain folks. But I was thinking just in the last few weeks, as my class wraps up, I don't know exactly how to do this, but one of my goals for the next couple of years is one of the things I have to do in my classroom is convince, make a case for how valuable preaching and worship is. So that, and then try to give students some tools for creating boundaries and protecting the time that it takes to do preaching and worship well. I don't know if I have that I don't know if I can do that, but I'm certainly going to try because I think that if I can convince them how incredible this opportunity to preach to people is, then maybe they'd be more likely to participate in programs like peer coaching and take the time and energy to engage these kinds of processes. I have a million notes and things I could respond to, but I'll just leave it there. So hopefully we can have some discussion later.
I'll just dovetail back on the recruitment piece. Maybe, yeah, I did these Beecher lectures a couple months ago. In my last lecture, I raised that question, so are we just seeing a very small group of preaching zealots who in these coaching programs, in these things, and some of them are in continuing education and so on, but there's a huge number of people who really, really need it, and usually those who need it the most, who just are not doing it, and we've got this amazingly brilliantly trained academy who's thinking deeply about pedagogy and how to teach, but then, who will do it? So I tried not to get grumpy, there was a point, I remember as I was speaking, I said, maybe I should get grumpy, because it is a couple of other little notes I had around things that were raised, questions that were raised. I appreciate, Lisa, your comment about how, it's not easy for preachers to get up and running on this now, and that's, especially working preachers in terms of doing this kind of peer coaching, not just getting into groups and doing it, but then learning how to do it well with each other, right? I mean, I was thinking just during this morning's conversation, about these groups that, around these international dialogical preaching experiments, where you've got to have groups of people who are willing and able at the baseline to listen, to actually pay deep attention, ferociously deep attention to each other. And that's not something that in our culture, we're just naturally good at. And there are a lot of people who are very, very much not good at it, who are in these groups. So just trying to get a baseline of, rules for listening and asking questions going is I agree with you, Lisa, a major challenge, and it's tough to get. So it's true in collaborative preaching. It's the other thing I was thinking this morning. When you've got groups you have to learn how to initiate things like turn taking. I mean, just basic stuff in groups and leading groups in order to make collaborative preaching work, but also to make these kinds of groups work and work well. So that's the reason why we felt so strongly that we have to have trained leaders running these groups. They have to really know what the heck they're doing. You can't this is not just, oh, well, let's read this great book by these wonderful people, we've written, and then everybody will just go do it. No, you really have to, somebody's got to be trained to lead it and to draw people's attention to what's not going as well as it should, and be able to articulate why and how it might do better. And I guess the other piece was the vocabulary piece you raised, Lisa, too. And I'm thinking, man, that's killer. So we were trying to get a little bit of vocabulary going, but everybody's got their own. But also, isn't this true about preachers too? One of the things we talk a lot about is like, so if you've got a preacher who's got their vocabulary for what they do, is it your job to impose that? There's a point in the book, there's somebody comes in and says, well, I just preach in spirals, and then they get smaller as we go. Well, no, I could sit there and pontificate. Well, that sounds like inductive preaching. Why don't you read Fred Craddock? But their language is what's important. So it may be that we're just throwing our language into the mix, into the hopper, but that your program's got better language, for this exact same thing, or a different language, and it works great, So I would hate to say that we in any way felt like our crazy language that we had to develop just to get from point A to point B in our program should ever be foisted on to anybody else. That would be, I think, a real issue. And then Larry, the online piece, man, I don't know what to say. You know, we got to the end of our 10-year process and we're hit with a pandemic and we had to go online. And we just felt like there were issues that hit us, and you were a part of that because you were in one of those last two groups. And thankfully, you were in a group that got to kind of experience both. Your last session, we all were able to meet together. So you got to see it kind of, and so there were things that worked and some of the things that kind of worked almost better online, you know, and there were some things that were not so good, you know. There are things that just through proximity and being able to have a meal together and you know, that you can get going in terms of formation coaching that you can't get just meeting as a face in a bubble. So, but we just didn't feel like we had enough of a sample of it, of people doing it entirely online. We did find that I think overall that everything worked fairly equally, that we were able to do this kind of coaching in the online world without it losing too much. And I hear you about the intersectionality of all of this. You know, yeah, there's a lot more around that. I think we did that in our teaching didactics on campus that just didn't show up in the book.
Thanks, y'all. We'll open it up for discussion at this point or questions. So in order to do this, I'm going to start with Trey's question, which is in the comments on the chat. But if you have a question that you would like to voice, I'd encourage you to use the raise hand feature. There are plenty of us in the room. And if you use the raise hand feature, that'll really help us identify you rather than just everybody trying to speak out. So I'll read Trey's question. So it is, thanks for this very generative and helpful discussion. Are there particular strategies that you found helpful as you introduced non-directive preaching feedback to students from high-power distance cultures where it is expected that authority figures give directive feedback? Is a really great question.
It's hard. I think you have to have some resilience. I have found some helpful language to think about this in Chris Hong's book on decolonizing theological education. I think it's called Decolonial Futures. I have also found I have also found readings on womanist preaching and feminist preaching to be really helpful in getting students to think about voice and embodiment. Because I think, I don't know, but I think that if I can demonstrate or convince folks that they have a unique voice and that they have a unique body, that they have a unique thing to say, they have something in them that needs to be written, then they can more easily understand why my own embodiment and my own voice can't just be imposed on them, right? But I think that Chris Hong book is super helpful in understanding kind of where this desire for direct authoritative feedback comes from, right? That kind of mastery that we're accustomed to in Western European education systems, the kind of grading system. So a lot of I even think about the book that I read on the books that I've read on grading and trying to think about new ways to grade speaks to a lot of this too, right? I don't know if that helps answer your question. To be short, I'm really trying to figure it out still because folks have that expectation in the classroom, and it's hard to change those pedagogical practices.
Trey, we tried to recruit people into our program to learn how to lead these groups. I know this is a little bit different from what you're saying. We tried to find folks who, from what we could tell in their application forms, would be at least open and interested in doing this kind of thing. There's only one situation I can remember where we just did not certify a person to be one of our coaches because they literally could not leave behind you know, these sorts of practices. Now, I do, in my recollection, Dale was a genius at helping. He was much better than I was in our program at helping persons with high power distance, from high power distance cultures and so on work. And he tended to be to ask questions of them concerning just why, why is it important, why asking these, or making these kinds of statements or asking these kinds of questions, are important to you, or where does that come from? So he would generally use our method of asking questions to query them about what it is within their own experience, immediate experience of the group and the process. If it had a reactive edge to it or whatever it was, that informed their behavior. And this was in a fishbowl context, and so it was one where it would require. So it was confrontational. It had a supervisory edge to it. Those kinds of questions did, but generally, I felt like they were fairly effective. But I only recall one experience of just not being able to give the certificate at the end of the program. That was, and we did have, and we had one person leave our program when we did it at Louisville.
Thanks so
For similar reasons, I think.
Trey, it also makes me think about the times that I have felt like it was my responsibility to give direct feedback,
Right.
even though I'm so steeped in this inductive method. Because there are times where I think that, oh, well, I have to say this, right? Like I have to stop this behavior. And in retrospect, I didn't, and it wasn't received well. I had a young man in his sermon compare himself to Jesus, and I wrote in the margin, you can't do this. That he learned nothing from me saying that, right? I had another student who wrote what I thought was a very supersessionist, anti-Semitic sermon. And I pointed him towards some resources and said very directively, like, you cannot preach this. And I wrote about that one in the book, but in retrospect, I really missed an opportunity to ask questions and dig into the theologies that he holds that would lead him to say something like he did, right? So like I slapped a Band-Aid on it and he changed it for that one sermon and was very responsive to the feedback. But I wouldn't be shocked if he wrote the same kind of thing in his sermon the next week, right? So I was directive and I solved the problem in the immediate, but I think I missed an opportunity to go deeper with questions and a more inductive approach. So.
Speaking of Band-Aids, we'll try to get to Joni's question really quickly because we're moving up against our time. So I'll read Joni's question. I'm wondering about fine-tuning the nuances between validating and, quote, affirmation Band-Aids. So many of us in ministry want to please others, and it's also hard to listen in the midst of discomfort.
Joni, can you say a little more about the distinction? I'm interested in between validating and affirmation Band-Aids.
Sure.
I think I get it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And from what I'm hearing you saying, this is part of what you're advocating, that people will feel heard and that they will feel validated in who they are and what's emerging in them. But there's a difference between validating and saying, yes, what you're experiencing is true. I believe you, in a sense, and like saying, well, of course we could all follow your introduction or whatever, like the Band-Aid approach. Like, how do we navigate that nuance? And then maybe more importantly, like guide like peer groups in kind of navigating that territory, because it is really hard to sit with someone who's struggling and says something that reflects like a wound that they carry.
Allie, you have a comment on that?
Good start.
Go ahead.
No, you go.
Well, Yeah, I think affirming is hugely important. I'm going back to the example that Ali gave from the book. There, the idea that this, if the idea of saving somebody is when they indicate clearly that they want help with something, and you literally erase what they just said about wanting help with into introductions and say you liked it. Now, what you've done is you've turned it on to yourself. You've made the whole thing about you and your experience and so on. So it's one thing to, now the affirming thing would be to say, to affirm that they're wrestling with doing with doing introductions, and say, I really affirm that question. You know, that's something, you know, let's really dig into that, you know, so that you validate, so you're validating them as a learner of preaching. But I would assume, I'm assuming that in terms of validating somebody's self-worth and value as a human being on this planet, go within the covenant setting process, that has to be dealt with. We're gonna, that we will always assume we are trying to do that, and we will work together to not to not in any way tell you that your life or the traumas you've experienced should stay somewhere else, you know, but that you have the right to bring as little or as much of that into here, you know, so you're creating a holding environment. So the business of creating that kind of space and holding environment is huge. But that has a lot to do with setting we talk about this in the book, setting covenants that work and setting space that works, right? So having a space that feels comfortable and safe and like a holding space is important. But saving is a little different trick. It's just not being willing to run with you with what you want to do, and so you devalidate your own sense of what's wrong with your preaching. You know, why would I want to do that? But boy, we do it. I mean, it happens all the time. Everybody, but trying to get a small group of peers to learn not to do that, just take your MDiv group and say no saving. If somebody says that they're worried about something, and we're going to give, of course, we hope in our groups we give them a chance to say what they are interested in, what they are worried about in their preaching. But you know, let's try not to devalidate that. I hope I'm understanding, Joni, what you're trying to get at.
Good. John and Ali and Larry and Lisa, thank you so much. We're going to have to leave it here. And this is a good sign that we've had generative conversation and we want to keep going. So I take that as a positive. So let's, those of us who are gathered to express our appreciation, however you feel is best. Thank you so much, you all, for joining us. We hope you'll continue with the pedagogy group, but you're going to have to use a different link. So we'll see you back with the second link at 2:50. We've got 2 great papers that we're going to be privileged to listen to, and we look forward to seeing you all again. So thanks so much.